that within most developed countries notions of pragmatism, notions of the fact that democracies have succeeded in tempering the market economy. In the 19th century, 18th century, the Industrial Revolution had some very negative effects on people, particularly working classes all over the world. We see data where life expectancy was reduced, hikes were reduced. We can look at medical records and see that actually living standards and much of among large fractions of the population actually went down. But eventually we passed legislation about working conditions, and eventually we circumscribed some of the worst kinds of behavior. In the 20th century we put regulations that imposed better environmental conditions, and so some of the damage was reversed, and that we have made the market economy work in ways that the benefits of it are at least far more widely shared than they were 100 years ago. There can now be no reasonable, science-based doubt about the reality of global climate change, effects brought on by the cumulative and rapidly growing emission of greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. As these effects become increasingly more obvious worldwide, so commercial interests, groups of concerned individuals, and national governments have been gripped by what amounts to mass panic about what to do about it. To many, Paul Ehrlich's Malthusian population bomb of 1968 appears about to explode in the world's face in an indirect version of his millenarian vision of population growth, which outpaces agricultural production capacity, with predictably catastrophic results for humanity. And his three-part crisis scenario does indeed seem now to be present: a rapid rate of change, a limit of some sort, and delays in perceiving that limit. Ehrlich's work was roundly criticized at the time, and later, from many quarters, and much of what he predicted did not come about. Nevertheless, can the world afford to take the risk that the climate scientists have got it wrong? As the chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Mr. Rajendra Pachauri, has recently pointed out, 11 of the warmest years since instrumental records began have occurred in the past 12, while major precipitation changes are taking place on a global scale. Hello. It's Megan. This week I'm going to talk about the difference between translators and interpreters. It's a common misconception that translators and interpreters do the same thing. So, I'd just like to highlight a few similarities and differences between the two. Firstly, translation refers to written communication, whereas interpreting refers to verbal communication. So for example, a translator will not attend a court hearing to verbally translate between the parties involved, but may translate the written evidence used in the case. Secondly, both jobs require different skills, and translate requires the ability to write well and comprehensively into a target language. This means that they need to have an excellent command of their native language. For example, although I can speak French to a good standard, I cannot translate from English to French, although I could translate from French into English. Which means I'm only halfway that to being an international player. An interpreter needs to be able to speak both languages professionally. Thirdly, the qualifications and experience required to become either a professional translator or interpreter do differ. Both roles acquire years of training with the resulting qualification. But what they can learn on the training will be completely different. So just to be clear, translators will translate written texts and interpreters will translate verbal communication. Well, the Voyage manuscript has many different theories proposed for it. Some people think that it's a complete hoax. It's now been carbon dated from the 15th century. So it's most likely, if it is a hoax, that's been a 15th century hoax, which I personally don't believe. But some people think it's just gobbledygook. It's just an invention to make money. Somebody made it to fool people and make money. Other people think it's probably a code. In other words, someone encoded lots of secrets in it, hoping that no one would find out. And if so, that's been very successful because no one has cracked it so far. But in my opinion, it is actually a genuine script. Obviously, a human devised script that masking behind it a genuine human language. In a language, it seems to me to have more, if you like, Near Eastern, maybe Caucasian, Asian aspects to it rather than European, because of some of the words that I've decoded. So I would imagine that once we've actually managed to decode the script, we'll find that the language underneath is a natural human language, probably from that part of the world. So various conclusions. Yes, bees are in decline. These declines are well documented. There are real and reported by good strong scientific evidence. Which is the only evidence? The drivers of decline are many varied depending on species. The effects of pollinator loss could be absolutely huge. So is it a catastrophe? Not yet, but it could be. The positive side, we are aware of the problem. Awareness is being raised with time and people are taking action to fix the problem. We recognize the problem, at least these being done. Language death is not mainstream theater. It is not mainstream anything. Can you imagine Hollywood taking it on? It's so far outside the mindsets of most people, but they have a difficulty appreciating what the crisis is all about because they're not used to thinking about language as an issue in itself. Somehow we need to change these mindsets. We need to get people thinking more about language. More explicitly, more intimately, more enthusiastically. Interest in language is certainly there in the general population. Most people are fascinated by such topics as where words come from or what the origin of their town's name is or whether their baby's name means anything, and they're certainly prepared to play Scrabble and a host of other language games at infinitum when you get language games on radio and television, but a willingness to focus that interest on general issues prepared us to take on board the emotion and drama inherent in the situation of language endangerment is not something that happens much. So what do we mean by well-being? Health, happiness, a sense of achievement and contentment, a state of mind and body where people can thrive. Well-being is not something that is purely limited to people who are facing extraordinary challenges in their lifestyle, health, or personal circumstances. Everybody here has a level of well-being. Music so often forms an intuitive part of our well-being management. Music to pick it up, music to calm our sense, music to heal our souls. Our aim through research is to move from this level of intuitive application of music through the informed use in our communities to take the next step in the understanding of the power of music in human life. Music already works for us on so many levels. Whether it's soothing and teaching our infants, bringing people and communities together, adding spirit to our work and personal endeavors. But there is no reason to stop here. We can and we should. And I am the professor of children's literature at Newcastle University, and I wanted to write a very short introduction to children's literature because although here in Britain we have one of the longest and most distinguished traditions of creating books for children, perhaps the longest and most distinguished in the world, we often take them for granted and we don't pay enough attention to what a remarkable cultural resource they are for adults and the kind of cultural work they do for children and the way that they have served writers and illustrators as a cultural space for creativity, subversion, and opportunities to experiment with new ideas. So what kind of cultural work the children's books do? Well, at the level of an individual child, this is one of the places where children learn the vocabularies, get the vicarious experiences, and see the images of the world that help them think about how the world works and where they fit into it, because children's books are one of the first places that children encounter these things. They are often very direct as a source of information about what a particular period thinks, including what it thinks a child is, what a child needs to know, what childhood looks like. Sometimes when we are looking at children's books from the past, that's very important to notice the kind of children who aren't there, for instance. So that is one of the things that we have in children's books. For great repository of stories that have been shaped for children in the past that tells us about the values of the past. The special theory of relativity was developed by Albert Einstein in spring of 1905, and the space of perhaps 5 and 10th weeks of thought, where he rewrote our understanding of space and time. Newton had given us an understanding of space and time back in late 1600s, which is very intuitive. It's the way we all think about space and time. Here is a space, it's just this environment, where things happen, and time is this relentless thing that ticks forward on our watches, our clocks, taking us moment after moment, second after second into the future in a completely uniform, absolute, and unchanging way. In special relativity, Einstein said that's not right. He said, space and time can change depending upon how you move. He showed that if you're moving, relative to somebody else, time for you slows down. And these kinds of revolutionary ideas are not simply esoteric, pen and paper type understandings of the universe. This is the timeline of the Big Bang timeline of the universe. Now we know that it began around 13.7 billion years ago. Back there, in the Big Bang. And we know that when it began it was really a formless, unimaginably hot ball of not even matter. In fact, we think that all the forces of nature emerged together. There were no particles as we know them today. But as the universe continued to cool and expand, then we think that the particles that we are made of and the forces that we're familiar with today crystallized out in one of the most important moments with something called, a fancy name called electroweak symmetry breaking, is the point when mass entered the universe for the first time, when things got substance for the first time. It's just back there about a billionth of a second after the Big Bang, and we're investigating that at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Geneva. We then know that the universe continued to cool and expand. After around about a second, then the familiar particles that make up the atomic nuclei of stars and planets, the protons and neutrons, formed in the universe. We know after about 3 minutes, somewhere around there was hydrogen and helium in the universe. The first two, the simplest chemical elements. The universe then continued to expand and cool. And after about 350 to 400,000 years, the universe was cold enough and diffuse